If you're a parent, teacher, or school leader, and you're sick and tired of the frustration, anger, and unfair treatment of children at high risk in our public schools, then perhaps it's time for all of us to do something about it. In this podcast, Dr. Amitra Berry brings you tips, tools, strategies, and tactics to build successful solutions while touching, moving, and inspiring all of us to transform our schools so that every child thrives. Here's your host, Dr. Berry.
Hey there, Equity Warriors. Today, I welcome Dr. Dana Goodier, an educational powerhouse with 23 years of experience. From teaching world languages to serving as a middle school administrator, Dana's journey is inspiring. She hosts the Out of the Trenches podcast, sharing stories of resilient educators, and has authored a book on the same theme. I had the pleasure of discussing my educator journey, a story of resilience, on her show, and I am thrilled to have her here to share her insights with you today. Dana, thanks for joining me.
Well, thanks for having me.
I know it's spring break and not spring break, fall break?
Fall break.
Boy, am I ahead of schedule. And things can be crazy as school gets started, and over the course of the year, that arc of the year, I know that every educator's journey is similar and yet different. But I want to start by asking you to share a pivotal moment in your life that shaped who you are today and how that has influenced your work.
Wow, I think I'm going to go all the way back to high school. So really, my interest in world languages, so that's what got me into teaching, was world languages, and going to Norway as an exchange student at the age of 15 and learning the language, and then really discovering that I had a knack for languages. Started learning French and German there. And then continued to take those languages in high school, and then went back to Norway to study for my bachelor's degree. But it all started prior to my sophomore year in high school. And then really getting into just learning and teaching world languages. I no longer teach world language at the school, but I still do tutoring online. And I'm currently the president of the Colorado Congress of World Language Teachers. So it's kind of a full circle moment, but that's definitely really what got me started in education and wanting to share just the culture and the language of French-speaking countries and German-speaking countries.
So how many languages do you speak? How multilingual are you?
So French, German, and Norwegian fluently, and then enough Spanish, I would say high intermediate level. Not completely fluent, but enough to get by and communicate with families and students that speak only Spanish. But I'd like to learn more Spanish, yeah.
So that's 5.
Yes.
Okay. Got it. Some of us are still working on perfecting English, but I tremendous admiration. I think I've shared that I am learning Spanish, some by immersion and certainly some by education, but I understand it's quite the journey, and always tremendous admiration for people who do that. Something I wish our school systems would do more of, encouraging multilingualism. So how did you get from classroom teacher to school leadership, and how did that sort of shape your perspective on education and educational equity?
So back when I was department chair, I started already, I would say, in the mid 2000s. I wasn't that many years into teaching, but when there was a vacancy in the world language department, and I became the department chair, and I started participating on the instructional leadership team and just kind of seeing, the back end work of school finance and just the planning for professional development from the perspective of the world language department, and also looking at the budget, right? Because there were always resources that needed to be replaced. So I started thinking about perhaps pursuing a principal licensure program at that time in 2005. However, I saw that on the course list, there were courses such as school, and I didn't really go further than one course at the time. I think I took multiculturalism. That's what it was called back then. One course, and then I picked the program back up in 2009. So really decided by then that that was the path I wanted to pursue, and having a greater impact with the systems, as I'd seen as somebody who was on multiple committees, like for attendance. I've worked in a variety of school settings, both with high needs and also schools with fluent communities. But I've seen a common thread in attendance. And, a lot of this was prior to COVID, but looking at reasons for students skipping classes at the high school level or, data in terms of tardies and where the students were when they weren't coming to class and kind of reasons behind that. So that prompted me also to becoming a dean. So I took my first administrative job back in 2018 and then went from there. And I really wanted to help support both staff who were maybe frustrated over both some of the behaviors in the classrooms and also students who were coming late and or were absent for multiple weeks, but also giving them tools to help their students succeed, whatever the background was. And most recently, I've worked with a high number of multilingual learners. So, when students are coming in throughout the year, and helping, the teachers just get to know the needs, because a lot of these students have missed schooling for a number of years and, their grade level math or reading skills might not be the same as students at the middle school. And then you're dealing with also the language barrier as well. So, kind of come full circle in that terms as well, not just working with attendance and discipline, but also being an instructional leader in terms of supporting with high needs school and multilingual students. But I really think of the systems level. I think of data. I think of how schools can look at how to do better from year to year. And, what are some ways we can better support our students? What are things that have worked in the past that may need to be revisited, or what are things that aren't necessarily working that we need to stop? So, I like to just support, the staff and hearing a lot from them and what's happening in their classrooms as well.
Okay. You touched on something. I did a podcast, I don't know, at some point in time in the past, somewhere in the catalog, about student attendance and students who show up late to school and the different ways that different districts and states deal with it. And one of the things that struck me, and it just, as you were talking, it just hit me, is that there are places in this country where students are punished for showing up to school late by being suspended or taken out of class. What are your thoughts on that? How does, to me, it just doesn't sit right. But you are truly in the trenches in a school. What do you see and how does that sit with you? What are you all doing?
Well, I really think it's not about punishing a student, like, let's say, taking them out of class or putting them in school suspension when they show up late. But it is keeping track of the data and the trends that are causing these students to be late to school. So recently I've seen what you call rolling entry. If school starts at 8:40, there might be kids coming throughout the first period of class. And I think for any educators who either are driving up to the building or there's a golf cart that some of the educators use kind of around the school grounds, they can see if there's students that are walking around or going maybe to the closest Starbucks or something like that. So there's a lot of students who might get dropped off, at the school on time or a half an hour before school starts, but then they take off and buy something, and then they roll into school sometime during first period. So I definitely think making sure, we know who those students are, because those are the students that will be coming in without a parent's note. Now, if a parent is unable to provide transportation to a student and they're getting dropped off late because of, a situation with the parent's work or a lack of transportation, now that's another, that'll be excused. But there's also sometimes busing concerns that the bus is coming late. So it's really having a concise system for having excused tardies versus unexcused tardies, and making sure that we're following through. Now, something I do believe after, for unexcused tardies, a student does need to be talked with and, reiterated expectations for getting to school on time. And it's very frustrating for teachers who are teaching, and student rolls in half an hour late, and with their coffee in hand, right?
I wasn't thinking about the kids that were going to Starbucks. I'm thinking more about the kids who are, the parents are gone to work at 5 o'clock in the morning or whatever, and they've got younger siblings, and they're trying to get their younger siblings ready for school and taking on the responsibilities of an adult, to make sure that the little ones are taken care of. And so by the time they get to school, they're late. And I know different systems are dealing with, you said rolling start times. And I think about some places where I've read where they're making sure that the high schools start after the elementary schools, so that where they have those situations, they can get the little ones, settled and not be punished or get to school late because they were trying to take care of those responsibilities. But yeah, Starbucks. I hadn't thought about that one. I did when I was teaching high school, had kids who would come in late to my classroom. Now I taught for a couple of years. I taught at in an affluent neighborhood at a high school where my kids drove better cars than I did. And they would come in bearing gifts because they knew they were late, but they wouldn't drink a Starbucks, and not in my classroom, at least. Very different.
And that's the thing. Like, school schedules are definitely things that I think can be looked more at now. I do see in the district I've worked in most recently, there's elementary schools and middle schools tend to start closer to 9, 8:40, 8:45, or 9. And then the high school still starts really early, like 7:15, 7:30. And so, it's because of the buses. Get the kids dropped off at the high school first. But like you're saying, if there are younger siblings that need to be watched, well, the elementary schools could start earlier. But there's a lot of districts where I don't see the elementary schools kids starting earlier. They're always the secondary school kids that do.
Yeah. I taught what they called zero period, and it started at 7 o'clock in the morning. And, I never once had a high school student that was enough of a morning person to be on time and bright and ready to learn at 7 o'clock in the morning. It's just something about the adolescent brain. You present at conferences. What do you talk about?
A variety of things. I have a few conferences coming up, and so I'm going to be speaking at AMLE, Association for Middle Level Educators. I'll be speaking about coming out of the teaching trenches, a little bit about what I wrote about in my book, and how, that is that time period where you're feeling like, you might not want to stay in education, and it's reevaluating your why. And it's really geared towards the educators that want to really fulfill their career and their why in education, but how can they make a difference maybe at their school, or becoming more active in committees, or maybe perhaps moving to a different role. So I'll be speaking at a speed learning session at AMLE. I'm also speaking at Learning Forward in December here in Denver, and I'll be speaking about your teaching style. So really, and thinking about equity in mind and our students and how they learn, and it's like a roundtable discussion. So it's a small group. And so we'll have a lot of input from the people who attend. But really talking about, like, a lot of people have seen shifts in the past 4 years in their classroom. And when you try to manage classrooms the same way you did prior to the pandemic, those tricks don't always work, right? And if there is a school that doesn't have a cell phone policy, a lot of the time it is difficult to get students to put away their devices, and just some of those things. And that kind of ties into, like, keeping teachers in the profession, but how can they learn their teaching style, and maybe some shifts that they need to make as well to engage their students more. So those are a few upcoming presentations I have, and then I have a few in the spring as well. But I also speak about equity and just finding out about your personal identity. I speak about doing finding your PD niche when you're thinking about your own professional growth and learning, because you might be in a school or in a department where they don't have any or much professional development. And when you're looking for things to learn, you might have to look outside your district. And that session talks a lot about what are some things you can do to develop your own personalized PD plan. And then I speak about just things to help with multilingual learners, strategies in the content area, classroom, and just a variety of topics for instructional leaders and also for those who work with discipline and attendance.
All right. I spoke at AMLE last year, so I guess we're missing each other by a year.
Yeah, I was there last year too, but I didn't know you at the time.
Yeah, we could have connected then. Well, that's not going to happen. And I think I'm at NCTE, National Council of Teachers of English, but you're multilingual, so don't suppose you're going to be there in Boston for that. Hey there, Equity Warriors. I want to take a quick moment to share something exciting with you. You know how passionate I am about equity in education, right? Well, I've created a special space, a safe space, where we can dive even deeper into these crucial topics. It's our Patreon channel, and I'd love for you to join me there. Here's why it's so awesome. As a Patreon subscriber, you'll get access to exclusive content that I will not share anywhere else. I'm talking additional insights, workshops like you would get in regular professional learning sessions, resources that can really amplify your impact in education. But it's more than just extra content. By subscribing, you are directly supporting our mission. You're helping to create more valuable discussions and resources that you've come to love. You're part of the change we're making in educational systems. And let me tell you, our Patreon community, it is something special. It's a place where passionate educators and advocates can come together, share ideas, and drive real change. So if you're ready to take your commitment to educational equity to the next level, I'd be thrilled to have you join me. Just head over to patreon.com/3E podcast. That's patreon.com/3E podcast. Remember, your support means the world to me, and it helps me continue this important work. Together, we can create the educational system all our students deserve. Thanks for considering, and now let's get back to the episode.
I will be at ACTFL, which is Association or American Council of Teaching Foreign Languages. So I'll be there the week before Thanksgiving. I don't know if that's when.
It's the same week.
Yeah,
it's the same week. Okay,
yeah, we'll talk offline. Where I'm going.
We'll talk offline on that one. You have a book, Out of the Trenches, Finding Your Way as an Educator in Today's Challenging Times, that relates to equity in education. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Just a little.
It relates really to how to really stay in the profession despite the challenges that you face as an educator. And I started my podcast about 4.5 years ago, and the book came out around 2 years ago. So I use my own story, I interweave it with stories of some of the podcast guests I'd had up until about 2 years ago. But I really talk about, like, you know, some of these situations maybe that I've encountered or other guests have encountered where they feel like they didn't necessarily have a voice when they were trying to speak for the students, whose families necessarily maybe couldn't speak for themselves, right? And the students that were missing out on educational opportunities, or, you know, when they worked in a school that might have had more of a school to prison pipeline, and the disciplinary system wasn't, you know, equitable for our students of color. So I do talk about a little bit in my experiences with that, but also more about just the educator well-being, and how, you know, we talked a lot during the pandemic about self-care, but it's also just making sure that you're taking time for yourself and not getting burned out, finding some of those really strategies to reevaluate and know when to take a break, but also when to speak up if need be to a supervisor or to a union rep member or anybody who can support you in your district. So it's really for the teachers and for their psychological self-care and well-being as well, to be resilient, right? And to know that there are ebbs and flows in this profession, and if you're dealing with it might not be it's not going to be forever. I mean,
let's hope not. Yeah. You know, there is a shortage of teachers, not just here in the States, but internationally as well. And I don't know that we recognize that as much, but teaching is being in that classroom without supports is difficult enough. And when you are working with populations of students that have challenges at home that, of course, they bring to school. So we have marginalized learners. We have students of low income. We've got foster kids, from just so many things that are going on in their lives. And if we, if educators, if classroom teachers are not getting the mental support that they need, it just makes that task so much more difficult. And I want people to recognize that, but I also want educators themselves to recognize that they don't have to try and do it all on their own, and that there's nothing wrong with saying, "Hey, I need help. I need support." Not long ago, and I don't know if you've seen any of the numbers or the research on the suicide rates of teachers is high. It's one of the, it's a very high risk, I suppose you'd say, a profession for mental crises. And, I think it's something that we need to call out. So I, applaud you for giving folks some strategies to deal with that and a place to look to how can I deal with this? What do I do? And that somebody is recognizing that, yes, this is difficult, and then I do need support. So.
Mm-hmm. No, I did not look into suicide rates for my book, and that's interesting to think about. But I know a lot of the stories of those I've had on my podcast talk about, the physical manifestation of stress, like ulcers or being hospitalized, feeling like they're having a panic attack, of those types of things. People that are, just working, themselves to bits, right, and really not recognizing those signs. And I think when you're talking about that mental health and the depression, a lot of the teachers, they're taking what's happening at work personally, or like students' attitudes that is more part of that systems problem. It could be the school culture itself. It could be, just expectations in the school, and also connections with families that are lacking. And really, especially veteran educators, if they're expecting students to behave the same way they did even 5 years ago, right? It's adjusting, right? And sometimes the teachers who are veteran teachers are wary of changing up their style, like I said, and that could cause just students to become disengaged.
Yeah, I sort of laugh, and sometimes it's out of humor and sometimes out of frustration and sadness. But the number of times that when I've been providing professional development where a teacher has said to me, I've been doing this for 30 years and this is the way I do it. And that resistance to change. And it's like, if we were doing it so wonderfully well the way we've been doing it for 30 years, we wouldn't have the data that we have right now. And it doesn't matter whether it's academic data or the behavioral data, the attendance data, all of those numbers speak to us and say there are some things that we need to change. But you said, we a lot of times educators take it home with them, right? It wears on our body physically. And I've sort of gone down a rabbit hole, but I was speaking with someone just a little while ago, and something they said reminded me of a student that I had like 20 plus years ago, and it still brings me to tears when I think about it. Those things, those connections we have with learners that stick to us, that stay with us, wear in our bodies. And I think it's important. I've been doing quite a number of conversations with folks about mental health, especially in our children, but in educators as well, that we recognize that that's something that we need to be aware of and stay tuned to or into to do good things. But let's look at something on a lighter note. Let's talk about language. Whether it's world language or sociocultural languages, curriculum and instruction. How do you think, with the experience that you've had with multiple languages, what do you think we can do to better serve all students, all multilingual learners, including those that only speak English but not school English? What could we be doing to improve in that area?
Well, I think, I'm seeing just recently in recent years, and I think it has to do with the teacher shortage, but a lot of schools are picking up curricula. And I have not taught world language since 2016 as a contracted teacher. And at that point, in the mid 2010s, they were moving away from using a textbook, and it more just focusing on things that were created within the department or in the district, and a lot of comprehensible input, and 90% in the target language and the conversation. Yeah. And all that. And I'm seeing more districts, because we have maybe positions that are going unfilled, or we having long-term subs. I'm seeing more districts relying to be more curricula driven again. And this goes for both world language and for students who are learning English. And curriculum don't always meet the needs of our students. The people who are writing the curricula they're far removed from the classroom. They might have been in a classroom 20 years ago, right? And some of the research they do might be based on some schools that they're connected with, but they don't represent all of our students across the board, right? So, some of the things that I've seen used most recently, I would not say, they might be at a grade level, but if we have students coming in learning English who aren't at the seventh grade level in literacy, for example, then it's difficult for them to comprehend text. And so a lot has to be then done and differentiated on the teacher's side. If we're talking about a English language arts curriculum, that's also the piece. We can have a curriculum that has many layers built into it, where the online version, students are able to get snippets of text. They can also find out how to annotate more easily, but sometimes those things can also be over scaffolded from the teacher. And it might be also, for the teacher knowing when to reduce those scaffolds for the student. And, I like the text to speech version for students who might be below grade level in reading, but it's also giving them more of an opportunity also to read on their own and discuss what they're reading. And this is also something you can do in world language. Sometimes it takes a little bit of background knowledge in the language, maybe year 2 of learning French or Spanish to read a short novel. I know there's some comprehensible input authors who write stories for beginners as well. But, I think the more students are able to read and the teachers setting aside that time, because I think there are teachers, the old school teachers who expect the kids are going to do it at home, right? So giving them books and having them take it home, but that's not necessarily going to happen. So, setting aside time, like maybe once a week, doing 20 minutes to a half an hour of reading, and this across any world language class, ELD class, or a language arts class, right? The drop everything and read, the Dear that they called it before, right? Having that time, and that kids also in a space where they're being able to calm their bodies and mind, but also having a text that they're interested in, because you could have a classroom library, but if it's an outdated library, or, a lot of kids today are interested in graphic novels. So you need to include a lot of those things, include what's popular today, what kids talk about with their friends, and, survey your students, right? Ask teachers, if you're a veteran teacher and there's newer teachers in your building that are a different generation, then asking them also for some tips on what you can use in your classroom library. And, even though your school might not have funding, it's easy to ask for, the GoFundMe page for teachers and different sites where you can get some money donated to have a classroom library, to have more supplies in terms of reading. But I think really building that time in, because I think better readers then become able to speak more about a content area, and then they're able to write more as well.
Well, let me ask you a world languages questions. You were talking about that. 2 things popped into my head. One was that there was a policy in the district that I taught in. I taught 6th grade. We were a K-6 elementary, 7-8 middle. And so part of that 6th grade, getting them ready to go to middle school, we would take them up for, a portion of the day to the middle school, and they'd sit through orientation and talk about coursework and whatnot. And a good percentage of my children were Spanish primary language who, we did not have a dual immersion program. So they were, immersed in English, all of the challenges that go with that. But one student asked about signing up for Spanish in 7th grade. And she was told that the Spanish classes were not for her. Spanish was her primary language, but the Spanish class was not for her. So this idea that we're the personal pet peeve, I think every child should be in some form of a dual immersion setting from the time they hit kindergarten. In Europe, I know when we first talked, you were in Europe. It's uncommon for kids to be monolingual, whereas here in public education, we try to make it the norm for monolingualism as opposed to either supporting the primary language and the language of school or more and more dual immersion programs. So I've got like 15 questions that are popping up in my head. I just want to get your opinion. What are your thoughts about multilingualism being developed either from kindergarten forward, or that as students get to that middle school level, if they have a primary language other than English, to make sure that that gets nurtured through some form of a world language curriculum?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've seen this. I've seen this initiative start and sometimes fail in districts. A lot of the time, here in the Denver area, they do have several schools that are immersion bilingual schools. Either, and some of these are charter or private schools, right? And so the students will then sign up and they'll learn Mandarin, French, or Spanish, and then they'll be immersed in the language. And it's usually a K-8. So the student will then be at a competency when they get out of 8th grade where they're able to probably take an AP class in French and take the AP exam. And then there are students who are in those types of programs who I end up then tutoring when they're a sophomore in French because they've been away from the language for a couple of years. And so they're trying to get back into the conversational language because sometimes there is no option at the high school. A lot of the time you're in a high school and they just have the Spanish 1 through 4, right? When you're talking about a student who has Spanish as a heritage language, most high schools, I would say, that have 1,000+ students do have a heritage Spanish class. If it's a smaller high school, they sometimes do just offer that Spanish 1 and 2. And that, saying to a student, you can't take it, well, they should be able to take it anyway, because a lot of the time they only speak oral Spanish. They're not necessarily literate. Spanish,
yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But a lot of these heritage Spanish classes will then help the kids who already speak the language become more literate in the academic Spanish. So, but it is really important if you're in a larger middle or a high school to have a teacher who teaches the heritage language class for academic Spanish. Now, in terms of kids being bilingual, in schools, I think it's also just that community push. If you are in a feeder area that has the International Baccalaureate program, that usually includes both the middle school and the elementary school. And if the elementary school has a primary years program, then they have to offer at least one world language. And sometimes kids will then go through that. And a lot of time at the primary level, the students that are in a Spanish class, it's just kind of they get a feel for it, right? It's one teacher for the whole elementary school, and they see the teacher once, maybe every 10 days. I've had a friend who works in that type of program, right? So they really it's kind of fun and games. They learn some vocab, but they don't really learn language until they're in middle school. And sometimes the middle years program that they do at the middle school, they might only have the equivalent of 1 or 2 years of the language, and then they go to high school. But I think those are the ones that keep those students learning that world language, and then they keep them through the high school. But then, sometimes these programs fail as well. I've seen schools where they have the middle years program designation, and they really don't have a robust world language program, or they have a lot of turnover and they don't have a curriculum that's really meeting the students' needs, or a teacher who's able to keep the kids moving forward and to take the diploma program eventually when they get to high school. So I think also it depends on the demographics in the area and also the needs. A lot of students where I've worked in recent years they're not interested in getting the college credit through AP or IB. They want to have a concurrent enrollment, right? Mm-hmm. They'd rather do the trades industry. And, so a lot of the IB programs in the Denver area have very low enrollment now compared to 15, 20 years ago because of just the students' choice for post-secondary.
Wow, interesting. The other thing that was just popping in my head, and probably not so much instruction-wise, well, somewhat. My second year of teaching was my second year. In order to get a full-time spot, maybe I'm talking to someone else out there who's been in this situation, I had to have multiple preps. So I taught world history, study skills, and Spanish 1. Go figure. And because my Spanish accent is Caribbean, I didn't sound like any of the other Spanish teachers on campus, for starters. And the other thing was, I felt that it was important for my students to hear the language more in settings outside of, and this is terrible, going to really age myself, the "Está Susana en casa? Sí, está con una amiga," the memorized dialogues that were in their textbook, but it's never quite set well with me. And the fact that I can remember that ridiculous dialogue 40 years later, 50 years later is just insane. My kids, I asked them or assigned them, their regular homework was to watch a novela. You could pick any one that you want, but you watched a Spanish soap opera every night. And it was hilarious to watch these high school boys, young men, who got hooked on these novellas and would come into class every day talking over time, talking about what was going on. And they were all involved in these stories. And at some point in the semester, one of them ended and the kids were just devastated. They thought that, like American soap operas, the novella would go on forever, and it didn't. But in their next year in Spanish 2, the teachers came to me and said, "We know which kids were yours because they all watch novellas and they speak with a Caribbean accent." And I said, "Well, there's more than one way to speak Spanish. There's nothing wrong with the little regional dialogue." And the fact that my kids spoke was different from most of the first year teachers. I learned more Spanish, not from my 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th grade Spanish classes, but from just being immersed in the language. And yet it seems to me, and maybe it's different in, where you are in other places, that we don't use that immersion into the language and culture more as a way to teach the language to our students in schools.
I do think there are a lot of schools that are, when they're tied to a curriculum and they're really focusing a lot on going over what this chapter says to do, and the teacher is not using 90% in the target language, then the students aren't getting immersed. And also, they're in that French class for 50 minutes a day. They're in English classes the rest of the day. So like you said, the kids that are watching the telenovela after school are learning more. That's something I would always tell my students, listen to French music, watch French shows, movies, things like that. Those are usually things that I would assign outside of school. So it also depended on if the students were doing that, right? But, spending time in the country, but it's also the motivation piece. Like, do they have an exchange program? I know some German teachers that do exchange with a class in Germany every year, right? And they have German students come here in February, and then the students from Colorado go there in June. But like, if you are learning a language and the student doesn't know when they might visit a country or use the language, then sometimes it isn't that motivating for them. Although if a student is learning Spanish, there are multiple ways that you can use Spanish in the community. That's the thing. They might think, well, they're just learning it because it's a requirement. So I think that's a piece that really hasn't changed much in terms of student attitudes over the 20 plus years I've been in education. But I do think, like, you do have those students who know, I'm going to learn Spanish because I want to be a healthcare worker and I want to serve a Spanish speaking community, or I want to learn French because I want to do a study abroad or something like that. So It's really what lies behind this. And I always would start my courses for the beginners talking about, like, these are the countries where they speak French, and these are careers that you could do knowing French and those types of things as well.
Yeah, I think just the knowledge, knowing that you can use it outside of school. It's not just because you need the credits to graduate or to get into college. But there are so many, especially when you look at multinational corporations, right, where you might get a job in the States, but you could go work in another country with that same company, but only if you speak the language of that country. And if we're not preparing students in the language here, or letting them know that these are the type of opportunities that are out there, the motivation may not be there. Anyhow, I have 2 more questions for you. One is about women in leadership, a topic that I know you're familiar with. For those listening, what would you say are maybe the two two unique challenges that women leaders face today in education. Let's leave it at that. Two challenges to be aware of.
Well, I think one is being taken seriously, right? I think if you are entering a school that has previously had a lot of male leaders, it's really making a point and, making sure that your staff understands where you're coming from and what your skills are, and being very concise and clear in how you want to lead, coming in as a leader. So I think it's that piece, right? Sometimes, like, unfortunately, there are still staff members who see women as, maybe being weaker in terms of leaders. When you're thinking about educators in general, you see a lot of women leaders at the elementary level, but not so many at the secondary level. So I think that's something that is changing, but it's also being somebody who's able to make changes in schools that need those changes and, establishing the positive school culture. But I think also one of the things with women in leadership is really having also authority over, if you're talking to business leaders, if you're talking to groups of parents, and having them partner with you for example, programs with the school and or parents when we're doing maybe assemblies or any type of outside activities with the students. It's making sure that we are, keeping those partnerships alive, right? And making sure that they know kind of what our expectations are of them and how we can continue these ties with the community. I think sometimes if they're used to dealing with somebody else coming in as a new leader, it's really showing them kind of how you roll instead of the previous leader, and then really continuing the work that has been done in the past. But also sometimes you need to find maybe some new partners to work with as well, depending on how they might treat you as a female leader at this school.
Yeah, I hate to say it's still a man's world, but in many ways. Yeah. Dr. Angela Davis once said, "I am changing the things I cannot accept." So I ask every guest, what is something that you cannot accept? And then how can the people who hear this podcast help support change in that area?
Going back to our conversation about educator well-being, I cannot accept that educators are leaving the profession because of maybe how they feel treated as an employee of a school, or how they feel treated maybe by parents or even other educators where they work. It's something that I really am passionate about changing, is looking at how educators can speak up for themselves or find ways that might not be within their school, but also through groups that are online, through just partnering with other educators that might be in different states, that might be in a mastermind group or just meet on Zoom, where they're able to vent about their concerns. Because I think sometimes when you're in a school setting and a lot of teachers are disgruntled, that just increases the level of toxicity and causes more people to leave. But there are ways to remain in education without having that mindset that everything is horrible. So I think there's just keeping in the profession and using those tools that help you grow and help you maintain a well-being and mental health. Like I said, don't take it personally if things aren't going well on the day-to-day at your job.
Okay. Thank you. Everyone, we're going to make sure that, or I know for sure, that a link to the book, Out of the Trenches, Finding Your Way as an Educator in Today's Challenging Times, will be down in the show notes. So you'll be able to click on that and purchase that book. As we wrap up, well, one, Dana, thanks so much. I know we talked about so many different things, but you're just one of those guests where your knowledge is so broad, it's hard for me to stick to just one topic. Maybe it's a little of my ADD kicking in. But as we wrap up today, I want you to encourage you to reflect on some of the things that have been shared today. And whether you're an educator, an administrator, an advocate, or an ally, think about how you can implement strategies to support educators in their classrooms, students, and your colleagues that are in the trenches. Join the conversation, share your thoughts on social media. Can I speak anymore? And then check out the book and the podcast by the same name, Out of the Trenches. Join me again next episode. And if you've got a question, a topic you'd like covered, or a special request, you can text that to me. Make sure you check down in the notes. That link is right there. And then remember, don't worry about the things you cannot change. Change the things you can no longer accept. And that's a wrap for today's episode of the 3E Podcast. Now, here's how you can make a real difference. First, smash that subscribe button. It's free. It's easy. Just do it. Second, share the show with anyone you know who cares about education. And third, consider becoming a supporter of the show. Together, we're not just talking about change, we're making it happen. Make a donation today to be part of that mission and change, and I'll catch you next time.